I'm with the Internal Revenue Service. Your offshore accounts have been flagged. With those 11 words, the blood drained from CEO Richard Harrington's face as he stared at the government badge. The man sitting across from him, Donnie Reeves, actually an IRS agent. He was the brother of a woman whose life Harrington had destroyed, and after months of meticulous planning, Danny was executing the most dangerous con of his life, one that would either expose decades of corporate fraud or land him in prison. As Harrington's manicured fingers trembled against his mahogany desk, Danny opened his briefcase to reveal documents that would bring an empire crashing down. Would Danny's audacious scheme force the corrupt billionaire to finally pay for his crimes, or was he about to become the victim of his own dangerous game? Comment below if you think Danny's extreme methods were justified, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice served in unexpected ways. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the hospital room. Danny sat beside his sister's bed, his hand gently holding hers, careful not to disturb the foreline. Sarah's face was pale, her cheeks hollow from weeks of barely eating. The doctor had called it acute major depression with suicidal ideation, but Danny knew the clinical term couldn't capture what Harrington Enterprises had done to his sister. 6 months ago, Sarah Reeves had been the proud owner of EcoThreads, a sustainable clothing company she'd built from nothing. Her workshop had employed 15 local artisans, mostly women, re-entering the workforce. They'd just secured their first major retail contract when Harrington's conglomerate swooped in. First came the lawsuit claiming patent infringement on a textile process Sarah had developed herself. Then the predatory buyout offer that would barely cover her legal fees. When she refused, mysterious health code violations appeared. Her retail partner suddenly backed out. Her business loan was called in early. We can restructure, Sarah had told her employees, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. We'll fight this. But Harrington Enterprises didn't fight fair. They never had. 3 months later, EcoThreads was bankrupt. Sarah's life savings were gone. Her employees scattered. Danny had found her in her bathtub, the water pink with blood from her wrists. I've got nothing left, she'd whispered in the ambulance. Now, as Danny watched his once vibrant sister drift in and out of consciousness, something hardened inside him. He'd spent weeks combing through Harrington's public records, finding patterns of similar tactics used against dozens of small businesses. The authorities didn't care. Harrington's political donations ensured that. The civil courts were too slow and expensive for most victims. Justice would never come through proper channels. I'll make it right, Sarah, Danny whispered, squeezing her limp hand. I promise. That night, Danny Reeves, former forensic accountant, who'd left the field because he couldn't stomach the ways the wealthy exploited tax loopholes, opened his laptop and began researching how to impersonate an IRS agent. He knew it was a federal crime. He knew he could go to prison. He did it anyway. Richard Harrington III straightened his brioni tie as his personal barber finished his morning shave. The penthouse office suite offered a panoramic view of the city he privately considered his personal fief. At 58, Harrington had built his father's modest manufacturing company into Harrington Enterprises, a conglomerate with tentacles in everything from textiles to tech. The Jenkins acquisition papers need your signature, his assistant said, sliding a folder across his desk after the barber departed. Harrington barely glanced at the documents before signing. Jenkins Medical Supplies was a family-owned business that had rejected his initial offer. The subsequent difficulties they'd experienced, their largest client mysteriously canceling orders, their bank suddenly re-evaluating their loan, made them more reasonable. Make sure the Jenkins family gets the basic severance package, not the enhanced one, Harrington instructed, and initiate the layoffs immediately. But sir, you promised. I promised to consider maintaining their workforce. I've considered it. He smiled thinly. Next item. That afternoon, Harrington stood before flashing cameras at a charity gala, presenting an oversized check to a children's hospital. His PR team had calculated the optimum donation amount, large enough to generate positive press, small enough to be essentially meaningless to his bottom line. Harrington Enterprises believes in giving back, he told the reporters with practiced sincerity. These children are our future. Later, in his chauffeured Bentley, he took a call from his CFO. The quarterly projections are slightly below target, the man said nervously. Then adjust the manufacturing costs downward. Harrington replied sharply, Sir, we've already cut corners on the safety protocols. I don't want excuses, Jackson. I want results. My shareholders expect consistent growth. Back in his mansion, Harrington mixed himself a scotch and reviewed the dossier his head of security had prepared on a competitor. 3 ex-wives had left him largely alone in the sprawling estate, his children away at boarding schools or living their adult lives with as much distance from him as their trust funds would allow. Sometimes, in rare moments of Richard Harrington wondered if there was anything real in his life beyond the acquisition of wealth and power. These moments never lasted long. The next morning, his lawyer called with news of yet another class action lawsuit from former employees at one of his factories claiming unsafe working conditions. Bury it in paperwork, Harrington instructed. Drag it out until they run out of money, or will. It was just another Tuesday for Richard Harrington III, CEO and sole moral compass of Harrington Enterprises. Danny's apartment had transformed into an intelligence center. 3 whiteboards covered with flowcharts, timelines, and network diagrams lined the walls. His dining table disappeared beneath stacks of corporate filings, news articles, and printed LinkedIn profiles of Harrington Enterprises executives. 6 months of methodical preparation. As a former forensic accountant for one of the Big Four firms, Danny knew how to follow money trails and spot inconsistencies. He'd spent years untangling complex financial structures for high-net-worth clients, skills he was now using for a very different purpose. Government credentials? Take 7, he muttered, examining the laminated IRS identification card he'd created. The hologram wasn't perfect, but it would pass a casual inspection. He'd purchased the badge holder from a government surplus auction. Danny opened his laptop to review the dossier he'd compiled on Richard Harrington. The CEO's schedule was predictable. Monday executive meetings, Tuesday board updates, Wednesday external meetings, his assistants, his security team, even his favorite lunch orders. Danny had gathered it all. More importantly, he'd mapped Harrington's financial empire. Public records revealed only the surface, but Danny had spent weeks connecting seemingly unrelated shell companies and suspiciously similar overseas entities. He'd discovered patterns that suggested tax avoidance on a massive scale. Not enough evidence for a real investigation, but enough to make his impersonation believable. The hardest part had been crafting his own cover identity. Agent Daniel Reynolds needed a backstory that would hold up to basic scrutiny. Danny had created a bare-bones LinkedIn profile, carefully backdated to appear established. He'd purchased a burner phone with a DC area code. He'd even practiced a slightly different speaking pattern and posture. Every night, he rehearsed potential conversations, anticipating questions, and preparing responses. He recorded himself and studied the footage, eliminating nervous tics that might give him away. The suit hanging on his closet door had cost a month's savings, a small price for authenticity. No real IRS investigator would wear anything off the rack when auditing a billionaire. Danny glanced at the calendar. Tomorrow was the day. His stomach knotted with anxiety. What he was planning wasn't just illegal, it was multiple federal offenses. Impersonating a government official, wire fraud, possibly extortion, depending on how things played out. On his nightstand sat a framed photo of Sarah in better days, smiling at the grand opening of her workshop. Beside it lay a newspaper clipping about a factory worker who died in one of Harrington's facilities after safety measures were cut. Danny took a deep breath and repeated the mantra that had carried him through months of preparation. The system is broken. Someone has to fix it. Tomorrow, he would become Agent Daniel Reynolds, and Richard Harrington would finally face a reckoning. Danny arrived at Harrington Enterprises precisely at 9 a.m. for the second day of his audit. The security guard at the desk recognized him, nodding as he signed in. The man's casual familiarity was the first victory of the morning. Danny was already becoming part of the landscape. Agent Reynolds, Harrington's executive assistant, greeted him with forced politeness. "Mr. Harrington is in a meeting. He's assigned Ms. Maria Vasquez to assist you today." Perfect. Danny had hoped to avoid Harrington himself. The CEO's suspicious nature made him the most dangerous person to interact with directly. Maria Vasquez, the company's assistant financial controller, according to Danny's research, appeared moments later, mid-30s, immaculately dressed, with a no-nonsense demeanor that Danny immediately respected. "I've prepared the conference room for you," she said, leading him down a corridor. "Which files would you like to review first?" "Let's start with the Conman subsidiary transactions from the last 3 quarters," Danny replied, maintaining his clipped official tone. Inside the conference room, Danny arranged his materials methodically, just as he'd practiced. Government-issued folders labeled with case numbers, a legal pad with precise notations. The theater of bureaucracy. As Maria brought in boxes of files, Danny noticed her studying him. "How long have you been with the service, Agent Reynolds?" she asked casually. Danny gave his rehearsed response without hesitation. 7 years. Transferred to the Special Investigations Unit after 4 years in standard compliance. She nodded, but something in her expression suggested skepticism. "Interesting. My cousin works in the Washington office. Perhaps you've crossed paths." Danny's heart skipped. "A trap, possibly," he replied evenly, "though the DC office has over 2,000 employees. I'm actually based out of the Baltimore field office." Maria seemed satisfied, but Danny made a mental note. She was sharper than anticipated. The morning progressed with Danny, reviewing legitimate documents while identifying patterns that confirmed his suspicions. Harrington's company was even more corrupt than he'd thought. Around 11, Danny's burner phone rang, the one supposedly connecting him to IRS headquarters. "Reynolds," he answered crisply, stepping away from Maria. It wasn't a planned call. Someone was actually calling his fake work number. Had he been discovered? "Hello, this is Melanie from the Internal Revenue Service," came a woman's voice. "I'm calling to inform you about tax deductions you may qualify for." A robocall. Danny nearly laughed with relief. "I'll call back," he said officially, ending the call when he turned. Maria was watching him intently. "Everything all right, Agent? Just a procedural update. Danny replied. Now I'll need access to the records for all transfers to Green Summit Holdings for the past year. Maria stiffened slightly. Those would require special authorization. Green Summit is a separate entity. Not according to our analysis, Danny countered, sliding across a diagram he'd prepared showing the connection between the companies. Same board members, same operational address in Luxembourg. I'll need those files immediately. As Maria left to consult with higher-ups, Danny knew he'd struck a nerve. Green Summit was one of Harrington's most carefully hidden shells. The game was getting dangerous. But he was in too deep to stop now. Jennifer Chen stayed late that evening, long after most employees had left the Harrington Enterprises headquarters. From her office, she could see the conference room where the IRS agent had spent the day. He was still there, poring over documents with an intensity that seemed personal. As chief accounting officer, Jennifer had spent 14 years at Harrington Enterprises. 14 years of watching Richard Harrington's increasingly questionable financial maneuvers. 14 years of pushing back where she could, documenting everything privately, and wrestling with her conscience. She'd almost quit 3 times. The offshore accounts, the systematic tax evasion, the creative accounting that bordered on fraud, all of it made her sick. But she'd stayed, telling herself she could do more good from the inside than as an unemployed whistleblower whose career would be destroyed by Harrington's lawyers. Now, watching Agent Reynolds through the glass partition, something didn't add up. Jennifer gathered her courage and knocked on the conference room door. Agent Reynolds, I thought you might want these files as well. She placed a folder on the table. Subsidiary restructuring from last quarter. Thank you, Miss Chen. His eyes flicked to her employee badge. I appreciate the cooperation. Jennifer didn't leave. Instead, she closed the door and sat down across from him. May I speak frankly, Agent? He looked up, his expression guarded. Of course. In 14 years, I've never seen the IRS send someone to investigate Richard Harrington. Not even after the Arling Joe expose in the journal. Not even after 3 former executives filed complaints. She leaned forward. Why now? Reynolds maintained his composure, but Jennifer caught the slightest tension in his jaw. The service doesn't discuss the origins of its investigations, Ms. Chen. Of course not. She slid a USB drive across the table. But if someone were investigating Harrington, they might find these internal audit reports interesting, especially pages 27-34. He stared at the drive without touching it. This would be confidential company information. Providing it to me outside official channels could have serious consequences for you. Jennifer smiled thinly. I'm aware of the risks, Agent. But after what happened to Sarah Reeves in EcoThreads, some risks seem worth taking. The change in his expression was microscopic, just a flicker of his eyes, but Jennifer had spent years reading people across negotiating tables. She'd struck a nerve. I don't know who Sarah Reeves is, he said too carefully. No, that's strange. Because when you were reviewing the subsidiary dissolution reports earlier, you spent 3 times longer on the EcoThreads acquisition than any other file. Jennifer stood up. And you have the same eyes. She walked to the door, then turned back. The external servers that house the records you're really looking for aren't accessible from this building. They're at the data center in Arlington. The access codes change weekly. This week's is on that drive. Miss Chen, he called as she opened the door. Why would you help me? You're risking everything. Jennifer thought about the factory fire in Malaysia last year. The workers' compensation claims Harrington had buried the families who received nothing, because someone has to. She answered simply, and walked away. The data center in Arlington hummed with the sound of thousands of servers. Danny had gained access using the credentials Jennifer provided, claiming to be conducting an audit, technically, not a lie. The night security guard had barely glanced at his badge before waving him through. Danny's fingers flew across the keyboard as he navigated through Harrington Enterprises' most protected files. What he found made his blood run cold. It wasn't just tax evasion. It was so much worse. A folder labeled Riverdale Operations contained evidence of systematic environmental violations at a manufacturing plant in Alabama. Internal emails discussed chemical dumping into local waterways. Risk assessments calculated that paying occasional fines was cheaper than proper disposal methods. Most damning were the communications with local officials' thinly veiled bribes to look the other way. Danny's hands trembled as he downloaded the files. Next, he found a folder marked Workplace Incident Mitigation. Inside were hundreds of worker injury reports across multiple facilities, many with disturbing notes about how to minimize liability and avoid OSHA reporting requirements. One document detailed how the company had covered up a factory floor. Supervisors repeated sexual harassment of female workers. Rather than firing him, they'd transferred the women who complained to lower-paying positions or found reasons to terminate them. Danny downloaded everything, his disgust mounting with each discovery. The offshore accounts he'd suspected were indeed real, but they were just the tip of the iceberg. Harrington had created an elaborate network of shell companies spanning 5 countries. The tax evasion alone was in the hundreds of millions. Most shocking was a folder labeled Competitive Strategy. It contained detailed plans for destroying smaller businesses that Harrington wanted to acquire, including Sarah's EcoThreads. The methods were systematic, frivolous lawsuits to drain resources, planted negative reviews, pressuring suppliers to drop them, even hiring people to apply for jobs, and then steal proprietary information. Sarah's company hadn't failed by chance. It had been methodically dismantled according to a corporate playbook. Danny felt physically ill. He'd known Harrington was corrupt, but this was organized evil on a scale he hadn't imagined. He inserted a high-capacity encrypted drive and began copying everything. This wasn't just ammunition for his confrontation with Harrington anymore. This was evidence of crimes that needed to be exposed regardless of his personal vendetta. As files transferred, Danny's phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Asking questions about your credentials. Be careful. His cover was beginning to fray. He needed to accelerate his timeline. The download completed just as Danny heard voices approaching. He quickly disconnected the drive, closed all windows, and adopted the posture of someone conducting routine work. 2 IT technicians entered, barely acknowledging him as they attended to a server rack. Danny nodded professionally and gathered his things, walking out at a measured pace, while his heart hammered in his chest. In his car, Danny stared at the thumb drive in his palm. He now held enough evidence to potentially send Richard Harrington to prison for decades. The question was how best to use it. The third day of Danny's audit brought a noticeable shift in atmosphere. The friendly administrative assistant who had greeted him previously was replaced by a stone-faced security officer who escorted him to the conference room. Inside, the documents he'd requested were stacked neatly, but Maria Vasquez was nowhere to be seen. "Where is Ms. Vasquez today?" Danny asked casually. "Reassigned?" The security officer replied curtly, "I'll be your point of contact." The man, whose badge identified him as Frank Dawson, head of corporate security, positioned himself in the corner of the room, ostensibly reading something on his tablet, but clearly monitoring Danny's every move. Danny maintained his professional demeanor, methodically reviewing files while mentally noting the increased scrutiny. Jennifer's warning had been accurate. Something had triggered Harrington's suspicions. Around noon, Danny excused himself to use the restroom. As he washed his hands, the door opened and Frank Dawson entered, standing uncomfortably close. "Funny thing, Agent Reynolds," Dawson said, his tone conversational but his eyes cold. "I used to work for Treasury. Still have lots of friends there." Danny dried his hands slowly. "Is that so?" "Yeah, called an old buddy this morning. Asked about this special audit of Harrington Enterprises." Dawson leaned against the sink. He couldn't find any record of it. Danny's pulse quickened, but his expression remained impassive. "The Special Investigations Unit operates with a high level of confidentiality, Mr. Dawson. Your friend may not have the necessary clearance." "Maybe," Dawson conceded. "Still, I thought I'd reach out to the Baltimore field office directly. Ask for Agent Daniel Reynolds." He paused. "They said they'd get back to me." The threat hung in the air between them. Danny had perhaps hours before his cover was completely blown. "I'll be sure to note your diligence in my report," Danny replied, moving toward the door. Dawson blocked his path. "I'm going to need your badge and credentials. For verification purposes, that won't be possible. Federal identification remains in my possession at all times." Danny met the man's gaze directly. "If Mr. Harrington has concerns about this audit, he can contact my supervisor directly." Danny pulled out his burner phone and calmly typed a number. "I'll dial him for you." The bluff worked. Dawson hesitated, then stepped aside. Back in the conference room, Danny knew his time was running out. He needed to get what he came for and leave before Dawson's inquiries exposed him. He quickly photographed the remaining key documents with his phone, hidden beneath folders. When Dawson stepped out briefly to take a call, Danny slipped a USB drive into the conference room computer and rapidly copied several critical files. As he was removing the drive, the door opened. Danny dropped it into his pocket, but not before catching the suspicious glance from Dawson. "Mr. Harrington would like to see you," Dawson announced. Now, Danny gathered his briefcase, mind racing. Was this the end of his charade, or his opportunity to confront Harrington directly? As they walked toward the executive suite, Danny noticed the security personnel watching him. Near the elevator, he glimpsed Jennifer Chen, who gave him an almost imperceptible shake of her head, a warning. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back. Danny managed to avoid the meeting with Harrington by claiming he needed to consult with his superiors immediately about troubling findings. The excuse bought him time to leave the building before his cover was completely blown. Now, sitting in his apartment surrounded by evidence of criminal activity, Danny faced the culmination of months of planning and a profound moral crossroads. He spread the documents across his floor. Environmental violations, tax fraud, worker exploitation, and the systematic destruction of companies like Sarah's Pay. The evidence was damning, but obtained through illegal means. Impersonating a federal agent was a felony punishable by years in prison. His phone rang. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. "Hey," he answered, trying to sound normal. "Danny, the nurse said you haven't visited in 3 days. Are you okay?" Her voice was stronger than it had been in months. The rehabilitation center had been helping. "I'm fine, just busy with work." The lie tasted bitter. You're not working right now, Sarah said, her tone suddenly serious. You quit your job months ago? What's really going on? Danny closed his eyes. I can't talk about it. Danny, she said firmly, whatever you're doing, stop. I know that tone. You're doing something stupid for me, aren't you? The silence answered for him. I didn't ask you to fight my battles, she continued, her voice cracking. I just need my brother, not a vigilante, not a hero, just you. After they hung up, Danny sat in the dark, her words echoing. Was he really doing this for Sarah, or for himself? Was revenge masquerading as justice? He'd started this mission with righteous anger, but now faced uncomfortable truths. If he brought down Harrington through illegal means, he'd be no better than the man himself believing the ends justified any means. Yet walking away meant Harrington would continue destroying lives unchecked. Danny called the one person who might understand. Jennifer, it's me. We need to talk. They met at a quiet coffee shop miles from Harrington Enterprises. They know, Jennifer said without preamble. Dawson's been calling the actual IRS all day. It's only a matter of time before they connect. The dots. Danny nodded. I've been wrestling with what to do with everything I've found. You mean whether to blackmail Harrington or expose him? Jennifer asked bluntly. I'm not a blackmailer, Danny protested. Then what exactly was your plan? Confront him, threaten to release the evidence unless he makes amends. That's extortion, no matter how you justify it. Her words stung because they were true. There's a third option, Jennifer said, sliding a business card across the table. Agent Teresa Ramirez, FBI, White Collar Crime Division. A straight shooter. I've been documenting Harrington's crimes for years but never had enough concrete evidence for her to act. If I go to her, I'll be confessing to multiple federal crimes. Yes, Jennifer agreed. But Harrington has committed far worse. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same. Danny turned the card over in his hands, weighing justice against freedom, moral clarity against personal cost. I need time to think, he finally said. That night, Danny stared at Sarah's photo, remembering her words. I just need my brother. By morning, he'd made his decision. Danny made his decision. Before going to the FBI, he would confront Harrington, directly not for blackmail, but for closure. Sarah deserved to know why her business had been destroyed. He called Harrington's direct line from a payphone. This is Harrington, came the curt answer. Mr. Harrington, this is Agent Reynolds, though we both know that's not my real name. A pause. The imposter? My security chief said you'd surface again. The police are looking for you. Before you have me arrested, I think you'll want to see what I have. The Riverdale chemical dumping. The Malaysian factory deaths. The offshore accounts. Danny's voice remained steady. And the systematic destruction of businesses like eco-threads. The silence on the other end told Danny he'd hit home. You have 10 minutes. Harrington finally said, giving an address. They met at an upscale bar. With private rooms in the back, Harrington arrived with Frank Dawson, who patted Danny down for weapons or recording devices. Sit, Harrington ordered once they were alone. Explain why I shouldn't have you arrested immediately. Danny placed a folder on the table. These are copies. The originals are secure, with instructions to release them if anything happens to me. Harrington flipped through the documents, his expression darkening with each page. You broke numerous federal laws obtaining these, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Yes. And you broke far more serious ones committing the acts they describe. Danny leaned forward. I want to know why you targeted Sarah Reeves and eco-threads. Harrington's laugh was cold. I don't even remember the company. It was just business. It was her life, Danny countered. She nearly died. Collateral damage. The textile subsidiary needed to eliminate competition before a merger. Harrington shrugged. Nothing personal. The casual cruelty struck Danny like a physical blow. All of Sarah's pain reduced to an accounting entry. What do you want? Harrington asked. Money. A job. Name your price. I want justice. For Sarah, for the factory workers, for everyone you've hurt. Harrington snorted. Justice. Don't be naive. People like me don't face consequences. This time you will. Danny tapped the folder. You're going to establish a victim compensation fund for everyone your company has harmed, starting with Sarah's employees. Then you'll resign and cooperate with authorities. Or what, you'll release the documents. Harrington smiled thinly. I have an army of lawyers who would bury any accusations before they saw daylight. I think the FBI might disagree. Agent Ramirez seems particularly interested in corporate crime. A flicker of recognition crossed Harrington's face at the name. I'm offering you a chance to get ahead of this, Danny continued. Minimize the damage. Show remorse. It might mean the difference between a few years in a minimum security facility and decades in federal prison. Harrington's expression hardened. You've made a miscalculation, Mr. Reeves. People don't bring down men like me without consequences. He stood abruptly. I'll consider your proposal. Expect my answer tomorrow. As Harrington and Dawson left, Danny exhaled slowly. The confrontation had given him no satisfaction. Only confirmation of Harrington's utter lack of humanity. His phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Did he agree? Danny typed back. Not yet, but he's worried. What Danny didn't know was that Richard Harrington was already making a very different kind of call. Richard? Harrington hung up the phone after a lengthy conversation with Victor Mercer, his longtime fixer. For 2 decades, Mercer had made Harrington's problems disappear from inconvenient lawsuits to nosy journalists. Now he had a new target, Danny Reeves. Find everything on him, Harrington had ordered, and I want those files contained by any means necessary. Across town, Danny waited in his apartment, the evidence spread across his kitchen table. He'd spent the morning organizing it for his potential meeting with FBI agent Ramirez. If Harrington refused to cooperate, Danny was prepared to turn himself in and provide everything he'd gathered. His phone rang. Jennifer Chen. Don't come to the office, she said without preamble, her voice tense. Dawson's called in extra security. They're watching the building entrances. Has Harrington said anything about our meeting? No, but he's been locked in his office with his attorney and some man I've never seen before. Danny, I'm worried. This doesn't feel right. I'll be careful, Danny promised. Have you secured your own documentation? Yes, it's with my sister in Philadelphia, but that's not all. They've been accessing the server logs, checking who viewed the sensitive files. They know about the Arlington data center. They know I helped you. Danny's stomach dropped. Jennifer, you need to leave. Now, get somewhere safe. I'm already gone. Took a sick day, but they'll figure it out soon. After they hung up, Danny paced his apartment, weighing his options. Harrington was clearly buying time while preparing. To neutralize the threat, the man wouldn't negotiate in good faith. His decision was made. He would contact Agent Ramirez immediately. As Danny reached for his phone, he heard a faint click from his front door. Instinct made him drop to the floor just as 2 men in dark clothing entered, guns drawn. Clear the rooms, one ordered quietly. Danny crawled silently toward his bedroom, adrenaline surging. These weren't police, they hadn't announced themselves. These were Harrington's men. He slipped into his bathroom, locking the door and climbing out the small window that opened to the fire escape. The metal grating creaked as he descended, alerting the intruders. He's outside. A voice shouted. Danny ran down the alley, hearing footsteps behind him. He ducked into a crowded coffee shop, weaving through tables and exiting through the kitchen despite protests from staff. 3 blocks away, breathing hard, he ducked into a parking garage and called Jennifer. They came for me, he said between breaths. Harrington sent people to my apartment. Jesus, Jennifer whispered. Where are you now? Somewhere safe. It wasn't entirely true, but I don't have the evidence with me. It's still in my apartment. That doesn't matter. I have copies of everything. Remember, we need to go to the FBI now. Danny closed his eyes, leaning against a concrete pillar. You're right, this has gone too far. Can you meet me? They arranged to meet at the public library in 1 hour. Danny hung up, then immediately texted Sarah. If you don't hear from me by tonight, call this number. He added Agent Ramirez's contact information. As he moved through the city streets, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that Harrington had just raised the stakes beyond anything he'd anticipated. This wasn't just about financial crimes anymore. It had become dangerous in ways he never imagined when he first put on that fake IRS badge. The FBI field office was a modern glass building downtown. Danny and Jennifer sat in a sparse interview room, waiting for Agent Teresa Ramirez. They'd been separated initially, each giving preliminary statements to different agents. When Ramirez finally entered, she wasn't what Danny had expected. Small in stature, but commanding in presence, she carried a thick folder and wore an expression of professional skepticism. Mr. Reeves, Ms. Chen, she nodded, sitting across from them. You've made some extraordinary claims. Impersonating a federal agent to investigate corporate crime is a new one for me. Danny met her gaze directly. I know what I did was wrong, Agent Ramirez. I'm prepared to face those consequences. Noble, she replied dryly, but my concern is the evidence. Illegally obtained information is problematic for prosecution. What about my documentation? Jennifer interjected. I've been collecting it legally for years as an employee. Ramirez turned to her. Your records are valuable, Miss Chen, but without corroboration, it's still your word against a powerful corporation. Danny reached for his backpack. May I? At Ramirez's nod, he removed a sealed envelope and slid it across the table. This contains account numbers, dates, and transaction details from Harrington's offshore network. Information I memorized, not copied. It's not documentary evidence, it's my personal knowledge. Ramirez raised an eyebrow, opening the envelope. You memorized all this. I was a forensic accountant. Patterns stick with me. Ramirez studied the information, her expression shifting subtly. This matches some intelligence we've received from international partners. She looked up. You realize you're still facing serious charges. 5 years minimum for impersonating a federal officer. I understand, Danny said quietly. Jennifer leaned forward. What about Harrington? Will you investigate him? We already were, Ramirez admitted, for over a year. But we've been hitting walls. Corporate crime is notoriously difficult to prosecute without insider testimony. She tapped the envelope. This could help us secure warrants for the official records. A knock at the door interrupted them. Another agent entered, whispering something. To Ramirez. Her expression darkened. Mr. Reeves. Did you tell anyone you were coming here today? Just my sister, Danny replied, suddenly alert. Why? Because Richard Harrington's attorney just called our office, claiming you're attempting to extort his client with fabricated evidence. Danny's blood ran cold. That's not their filing formal charges, Ramirez continued, and they've submitted surveillance footage of your meeting with Harrington yesterday. There's no way they had recording devices, Jennifer protested. Dawson searched Danny thoroughly. The recording came from Harrington's cufflink, Ramirez explained. Apparently, he wears a personal security device at all times.
What is it?
The recording show? Danny asked, conveniently. Only portions where you appear to be demanding Harrington establish a fund in exchange for not releasing damaging information. Danny closed his eyes. He'd walked right into Harrington's trap. Agent Ramirez, he said, opening his eyes. Check the chemical testing results from the Rivendell facility against EPA standards. Check the employee death records at the Malaysian factory against the official reports. The evidence will speak for itself. Ramirez studied him for a long moment. We'll investigate all angles, Mr. Reeves, but I need to be clear. You've complicated matters significantly with your vigilante approach. She stood. I need to consult with the U.S. Attorney's Office. In the meantime, you're both required to stay in the city. After she left, Danny turned to Jennifer. I'm sorry I dragged you into this. You didn't drag me anywhere, she replied, firmly. I've been waiting years for someone to finally stand up to Harrington, even if we both end up in prison. Jennifer's smile was grim but determined. Some things are worth the risk. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Danny and Jennifer's meeting with the FBI. The headline in the Wall Street Journal read, Federal investigators raid Harrington Enterprises amid tax fraud allegations. Danny read the article from the small table in his apartment, where he'd been essentially hiding since being released on his own recognizance. The charges against him impersonating a federal officer, attempted extortion, and computer fraud hung over his head like a sore dot. His phone rang. Sarah, are you watching the news? She asked without preamble. Reading it, Danny replied. They actually did it. They're saying the FBI had been investigating for months before the raid. That doesn't sound like it's not the whole truth, Danny confirmed, but it's how they have to frame it. The raid was just the beginning. By afternoon, financial news channels were reporting that Harrington Enterprises stock had plummeted 27% on the news. Trading was temporarily halted amid the volatility. Jennifer texted, Turn on CNBC. Danny flipped on the television to see Richard Harrington himself, surrounded by attorneys, making a statement outside his corporate headquarters. These allegations are completely unfounded, he was saying, his usual confidence noticeably strained. Harrington Enterprises operates with the highest ethical standards. We are cooperating fully with authorities to clear up this misunderstanding, a reporter shouted. Mr. Harrington, what about the claims from former employees about unsafe working conditions? Harrington's face tightened. I won't dignify anonymous accusations with a response. Next question. Sir, can you comment on reports that the chemical spill in Riverdale last year was deliberately covered up by your company? Harrington's attorney immediately stepped forward. No further questions at this time. As they retreated into the building, the camera caught something Danny had never seen before. Fear in Richard Harrington's eyes. By evening, the story had expanded exponentially. Former employees began coming forward with their own accounts of workplace abuses. Environmental activists connected the dots between Harrington's facilities and local health concerns. Business journalists dug into the company's acquisition history, identifying patterns of predatory behavior. Sarah called again. My phone's been ringing all day. Former EcoThreads employees, other small business owners who were crushed by Harrington. Someone's connecting all the dots. Jennifer, Danny said. She must have reached out to everyone she had documentation on. The next morning brought another development. A group of Harrington Enterprises shareholders filed a lawsuit against the company's board of directors for breach of fiduciary duty. Financial analysts began speculating about whether the company could survive the mounting legal challenges. Agent Ramirez called Danny for additional questioning. The tone had shifted less about his crimes, more about corroborating specific details about Harrington's operations. What's happening with my case? Danny asked at the end of the interview. Still under review by the U.S. Attorney, Ramirez replied carefully. But I can tell you that Jennifer Chen has formally registered as a whistleblower under federal protection statutes. Her testimony is proving ... significant. And Harrington. I can't comment on an ongoing investigation, but off the record, Ramirez's professional mask slipped momentarily. We've executed search warrants on 3 additional properties. The evidence is substantial. That night, Danny watched more coverage from his couch, emotions churning. The justice he'd sought was unfolding, but his own future remained uncertain. He might still go to prison for years. His doorbell rang, a rare occurrence that immediately put him on alert. Cautiously, he checked the PEEPHOLE. It was Sarah, holding a bakery box. I brought pie, she said when he opened the door. Seemed like you could use it. Sarah sat across from Danny at a small kitchen table, the apple pie between them mostly untouched. Her recovery had progressed remarkably, color in her cheeks, clear eyes, steady hands. The sister he remembered before Harrington destroyed her business? You should have told me, she said quietly. Danny studied his plate. You were focusing on healing. I'm your sister. We don't keep secrets like this. She reached across the table to take his hand, impersonating a federal agent. That's a serious crime, Danny. I know why. Why risk everything like that? Danny finally met her eyes. Because the system is broken. Because people like Harrington never face consequences. Because what happened to you wasn't fair. Life isn't fair, Sarah countered. That doesn't justify breaking the law. So I should have done nothing. Watched you suffer while he got richer? Sarah squeezed his hand. I never asked you to avenge me. I know you didn't. Danny's voice cracked slightly. But someone had to. Hold him accountable. The doorbell rang again. This time it was Agent Ramirez. Ms. Reeves. She nodded to Sarah. I need to speak with your brother. Officially. Danny invited her in, tension coiling in his stomach. The U.S. attorney has made a decision regarding your case, Ramirez announced without preamble. Danny straightened, preparing himself for the worst. Given your cooperation and the extraordinary circumstances, they're offering a deal. Full immunity from prosecution in exchange for comprehensive testimony against Harrington and his executives. The words didn't immediately register. Immunity? As in, no charges. No prison time, Ramirez clarified, but there are conditions. 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and you'll need to make a public statement acknowledging your actions were illegal and inappropriate. Why the change? Danny asked, suspicious. 3 days ago I was facing years in federal prison. Ramirez's expression remained professional, but something like respect flickered in her eyes. The evidence you and Ms. Chen provided has opened up one of the largest corporate fraud cases in a decade. Multiple agencies are now involved: DPA, OSHA, SEC. The U.S. attorney feels your testimony is more valuable than your prosecution. She handed him a document. The formal agreement? Review it with an attorney? After Ramirez left, Sarah broke the stunned silence. So, you're not going to prison? Apparently not. Danny stared at the papers in his hand. Are you disappointed? Sarah asked, studying his expression. What? No, of course not. Then why do you look so conflicted? Danny sank back into his chair. Because I broke the law, Sarah. I crossed lines I never thought I would. I lied, manipulated, stole information. Part of me feels like I should face consequences for that. From where I'm sitting, Sarah said carefully, it looks like you already have. You've spent months consumed by this vendetta. You've risked everything. That's punishment enough. She cut 2 slices of pie, sliding one toward him. Besides, the real work is just beginning. What do you mean your testimony? Helping the authorities build their case, making sure Harrington actually faces justice. Sarah held his gaze. Will you see it through? The right way this time? Danny took a bite of pie, considering her words. Yes, he finally said. I will. Good, Sarah nodded, because that's what I need from my brother, not a vigilante. Just someone who stands up for what's right within the law. For the first time in months, Danny felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. The federal raid on Harrington Enterprises headquarters began at 6:15 a.m. on a Thursday. Danny watched it unfold on live television, an eerie experience after having walked those same hallways under false pretenses weeks earlier. Agents and FBI windbreakers streamed through the glass doors, carrying boxes of evidence out hours later. The cameras caught the moment Richard Harrington was escorted out, not in handcuffs, but visibly shaken, surrounded by attorneys. The CEO's carefully cultivated image of invincibility crumbled under the harsh morning light and clicking cameras. Richard Harrington, are you being arrested? Shouted a reporter. No comment, barked an attorney, ushering him into a waiting car. But the most stunning moment came hours later when Frank Dawson, Harrington's head of security, was seen entering the FBI field office without Harrington's lawyers. Jennifer called Danny immediately. Dawson's flipping, she said without preamble. He knows where all the bodies are buried. Literally, Danny asked, only half joking. With Harrington, who knows? Her voice was tense with excitement. The House of Cards is collapsing. That afternoon, Danny received a call from Agent Ramirez requesting he come in to review his testimony against specific allegations that had emerged. When he arrived, she led him to a conference room where several other agents and a representative from the SEC waited. Mr. Reeves began, one of the agents. We need to confirm details about the Riverdale chemical dumping incidents. 4-3 hours, Danny walked them through everything he'd discovered, pointing out key documents and explaining the financial trails that connected Harrington personally to the decisions. He structured it carefully, Danny explained, but there's a distinct pattern in how funds were moved to pay off local officials after each environmental incident. The second investigator leaned forward, and you're certain Harrington himself was aware, not just his subordinates. He micromanaged everything, Danny confirmed. Nothing happened without his approval, especially financial decisions. Jennifer Chen can verify that. As the meeting concluded, Ramirez pulled Danny aside. There's something you should know. We've identified at least 17 small businesses that were systematically targeted by Harrington's company, including your sisters. The tactics match exactly what you described. Danny's throat tightened. Will there be restitution? We're pushing for it as part of any plea agreement, she replied. No promises, but the evidence is overwhelming. Outside the federal building, Danny was startled to find a small group of former Eco3's employees waiting. Sarah stood among them. What's this? He asked, approaching cautiously. A woman Danny recognized as Sarah's former production manager stepped forward. We wanted to thank you, she said simply. For years we thought we'd just failed. Now we know the truth. Sarah's eyes shone with unshed tears. I told them what you did, how you risked everything. Danny shook his head, embarrassed. I broke the law. That's nothing to admire. You gave us back our dignity. Another former employee countered. That counts for something. That evening, breaking news alerts flashed across Danny's phone. The Harrington Enterprises board had called an emergency meeting. By nightfall, they announced Richard Harrington had been removed as CEO, pending the outcome of federal investigations. The financial networks showed employees cheering outside company headquarters. Former workers gave emotional interviews about years of mistreatment finally coming to light. Danny watched it all with a complex mix of emotions: vindication, relief, and a lingering discomfort about his methods. His phone buzzed with a text. From Jennifer, it's really happening. I never thought I'd see this day. He replied simply, justice is slow, but it comes eventually. 3 months after the raid, Richard Harrington stood in a federal courtroom, surrounded by his legal team. Gone was the bespoke tailoring and commanding presence. The man who entered a guilty plea looked diminished, almost ordinary. Danny sat in the back row beside Sarah and Jennifer, watching as the judge addressed the former CEO. Mr. Harrington, you understand that by pleading guilty to these 15 counts, you waive your right to a trial? Yes, Your Honor, Harrington replied, his voice subdued. The plea agreement had been headline news for days. Harrington would serve between 4 and 7 years in a minimum security facility. He would pay $142 million in fines and restitution. Most significantly, he had agreed to cooperate with ongoing investigations into corporate practices across his former empire. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the prosecutors. This sends a clear message, the U.S. attorney announced. No one is above the law, regardless of wealth or position. Danny, Sarah, and Jennifer slipped away from the media circus, finding a quiet cafe several blocks away. 7 years, Jennifer said, stirring her coffee. It doesn't seem enough for all the lives he ruined. It's more than most corporate criminals ever face, Danny pointed out, and the financial penalties will hurt him more than the prison time. Sarah watched her brother carefully. Are you satisfied? Was it worth it? Danny considered the question. I don't know if satisfied is the right word, but seeing him actually face consequences. Yes, that matters. Later that afternoon, Danny met with the administrators of the newly established Harrington Victims Compensation Fund as part of the plea agreement. $75 million had been set aside for individuals and small businesses harmed by Harrington's predatory practices. We've identified 372 potential claimants so far, explained the lead administrator. Your sister's case will be among the first reviewed. She's not looking for a handout, Danny clarified. Just the opportunity to rebuild what was taken from her. The next day brought Danny's own formal sentencing for his role in the case. Despite the immunity agreement, he still faced the judge for the official record. Mr. Reeves, the judge addressed him directly. While the court acknowledges your cooperation has been instrumental in bringing significant corporate crimes to light, I cannot condone your methods. Danny stood straight, accepting the rebuke. You took the law into your own hands, impersonated a federal officer, and obtained evidence illegally. These are serious offenses that normally carry substantial prison terms. The judge adjusted her glasses. However, given the extraordinary circumstances and the prosecutor's recommendation, I am sentencing you to 3 years probation and 200 hours of community service. Additionally, you will make a public statement acknowledging that vigilante justice is never appropriate, regardless of the provocation. Danny nodded. I understand, Your Honor. Outside, a smaller group of reporters waited for him. Mr. Reeves, do you regret your actions? One called out. Danny paused, considering his words carefully. I regret finding myself in a situation where I felt breaking the law was the only recourse. I regret that legitimate channels seemed closed to ordinary people harmed by powerful interests, but I don't regret that Richard Harrington is finally facing justice. As he walked away from the courthouse, Danny reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. He had broken laws he once would have considered inviolable. He had risked his freedom and future, and while justice had ultimately prevailed, the cost had been high. Head's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Community Center needs financial literacy volunteers, counting toward your community service hours. Despite everything, Danny smiled. Maybe this was how redemption really worked. Not in grand gestures or vigilante schemes, but in small acts of rebuilding. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the sunlit space of her new workshop. It wasn't as large as the original EcoThreads facility, but the exposed brick walls and tall windows created an atmosphere of possibility. 3 sewing machines hummed steadily as former employees, now rehired, worked on the first orders for their revived sustainable clothing line. "What do you think?" Sarah asked as Danny wandered through the space. "It's perfect," he replied honestly. "Better than before." With her settlement from the Victims Fund and a small business revival grant, Sarah had relaunched EcoThreads with a more focused mission. The company now specifically employed women recovering from economic hardship, teaching skills while creating sustainable fashion. "We've already sold out the first collection," she said proudly. Turns out being known as the company that fought back against Harrington is good for business. Danny's own life had settled into a new rhythm. His weekly check-ins with his probation officer were now routine. His community service hours at the Financial Literacy Center had evolved into a regular volunteer position, helping people understand and manage their finances. His phone rang. Jennifer Chen. "Turn on CNBC," she said without preamble. Danny found the remote for the small TV in Sarah's office. The business channel showed Harrington Enterprises headquarters with a crawling headline. "Former Harrington executives vote to rebrand as Phoenix Industries." The camera cut to Jennifer herself, standing at a podium. "As the new chief executive officer, I'm committed to transforming this company's culture from the ground up," she was saying. "Phoenix Industries will prioritize ethical business practices, environmental responsibility, and fair treatment of employees at every level." "She got the top job," Danny said, impressed. "The board wanted someone untainted by the scandals." Sarah remarked, "And she knows where all the problems are." After his shift at the community center that evening, Danny found Agent Ramirez waiting outside, taking up stalking. "Agent?" he asked with a wry smile. "Just happened to be in the neighborhood," she replied, falling into step beside him. "Thought you might want to know Richard Harrington reported to federal prison this morning." Danny nodded, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. "Justice served, I suppose." "Also," Ramirez continued, "the Department of Justice is establishing a new task force focused on corporate accountability. They're looking for consultants with forensic accounting backgrounds and unique insights into how these schemes work." Danny stopped walking. "Are you offering me a job?" "Not officially, but if you were to apply once your probation ends next year, your application would receive favorable consideration." "Working for the same government I impersonated," Danny said, shaking his head at the irony. "Sometimes the system needs people who understand its failures," Ramirez replied. Later that night, Danny scrolled through news reports about the ongoing fallout from the Harrington case. Additional executives had been charged. Class action lawsuits from shareholders and victims continued to move through the courts. Legislative hearings on corporate accountability had been scheduled. A text arrived from Sarah. "Channel 7 just did a segment on EcoThreads revival. We're the poster child for second chances." Danny smiled at his phone. Second chances, indeed. For Sarah's business. For the employees who had lost their livelihoods. For Jennifer, now rebuilding a company from the ashes of corruption. And perhaps, even for him, a chance to fight for justice from within the system rather than outside it. He texted back, "Proud of you. Always was." It wasn't a perfect ending. Real life rarely offered those. But it was something better. A new beginning. Hard one, and honest. 1 year to the day after Richard Harrington's sentencing, Danny stood at the edge of a community center meeting room, watching as people filtered in. Some faces he recognized from news coverage: former employees of Harrington's factories, small business owners who had been targeted for acquisition, environmental activists from communities affected by corporate pollution. Sarah moved through the crowd, greeting everyone with the quiet confidence that had fully returned during her business's revival. EcoThreads was now thriving, with orders backed up for months and a waiting list of workers hoping to join the team. "Quite a turnout," Jennifer Chen remarked, appearing at Danny's side. As CEO of Phoenix Industries, she had spent the past year implementing sweeping reforms, from executive compensation limits to environmental cleanup initiatives. "I'm surprised you could make it," Danny said. "Aren't you testifying before Congress next week?" Jennifer nodded. "On corporate accountability legislation. Your name came up in the preparation sessions, you know? As an example of how the system fails, whistleblowers." "I wasn't exactly a whistleblower," Danny pointed out. "More like an impersonator with good intentions." "Semantics?" Jennifer dismissed. With a wave, "The point is, people shouldn't have to go to such extremes to expose corporate corruption." The informal gathering served multiple purposes: part support group, part networking opportunity, part celebration of how far they'd all come. Sarah had organized it as a way to mark the anniversary and strengthen the community that had formed in the wake of Harrington's downfall. Midway through the evening, Sarah clinked a glass for attention. The room quieted. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "A year ago, many of us were still reeling from the aftermath of Richard Harrington's crimes. Some of us had lost businesses, others had lost jobs, savings, or even loved ones." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Today, we gather not to dwell on what was taken, but to celebrate what we've rebuilt together." She gestured around the room. New businesses have launched, class action settlements have provided some measure of justice. Laws are being reconsidered. Her eyes found Danny in the crowd. None of this would have happened without people willing to stand up and say enough. My brother took an extreme and illegal approach. Laughter rippled through the room, which I absolutely do not endorse. But his actions remind us that justice sometimes requires courage and sacrifice. After the formal portion concluded, Danny found himself approached by a man he recognized as Agent Ramirez's supervisor at the FBI. Mr. Reeves. The man extended his hand. Thomas Wilson, White-Collar Crime Division. Do you have a moment? They stepped into a quiet corner. Your probation ends next month, correct? Wilson asked. Danny nodded. 23 days, but who's counting? We've been following your community service work. Impressive commitment. Just fulfilling my obligation, Danny replied, though they both knew he'd exceeded his required hours months ago. Agent, Ramirez mentioned she discussed potential consulting opportunities with you last year. That offer still stands, with one modification. Wilson handed Danny a business card. We'd like to consider you for a full-time position with our corporate crime task force. Danny stared at the card. You want to hire someone who impersonated a federal agent? Wilson smiled slightly. We want someone who understands how these systems can be manipulated from both sides. Think about it. Later, as the gathering wound down, Danny helped Sarah stack chairs. So, she said casually, the FBI? Huh, news travels fast. Jennifer overheard. She thinks you should take it. Danny leaned against the wall, considering. Would be ironic, wouldn't it? From federal impersonator to federal employee? I think it would be fitting, Sarah countered. Full circle, in the best way. Outside, the evening air carried the first hint of spring. Danny thought about the path that had brought him here, from desperate brother to vigilante investigator to whatever came next. You know, he said to Sarah as they walked to their cars. When this all started, I just wanted revenge for what happened to you. I never imagined it would lead to actual systemic change. Sarah linked her arm through his. Sometimes justice comes from unexpected places. The important thing is that it comes. Danny nodded, looking up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. The future, for the first time in a long while, seemed full of possibility rather than shadows. I think I'm ready for what's next, he said simply. Sarah smiled. I know you are.